Hello all, I'm Meir Soloveichik, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you back to Faith in America, a series of conversations that I'll be conducting with public figures, thinkers, scholars, theologians, and political leaders. The term Faith in America has two meanings, and both are subjects in which we will engage. First, we seek to study the state of religion within the United States. And second, by Faith in America, we intend to convey that we will also examine the reasons we have for having hope and faith in the endurance of the American experiment, the principles for which America stands. I'm especially delighted to welcome today to the conversation Dr. Ruth Wisse, a very dear friend of mine whose friendship and whose family's friendship has been a real blessing in my life and the life of my family.
It was too.
Dr. Wisse was for many years the Martin Peretz Professor of Yiddish Literature at Harvard University. She has written and published any number of extraordinarily important books. She is the winner of the National Jewish Book Award, and in 2007 she was awarded the National Humanities Medal by the President of the United States. But Professor Wisse is more than just an extraordinary scholar and incisive thinker. She has also, within the Academy, fearlessly stood up both for the principles of open inquiry for which the Academy is supposed to stand, and also has stood up for Israel and for the Jewish people within an academic world that has grown increasingly more hostile to the State of Israel, to Zionism, and indeed to the openness of inquiry itself. Because of the courage that she has consistently shown, she is truly an academic Eishes Chayil, if I may say, a courageous woman of valor, a role model and hero of mine. And it's because of her fearlessness, her eloquence, and her courage that in less than 2 weeks' time, she will be awarded the Herzl Prize by the Tikvah Fund at their annual Jewish Leadership Conference. And so I'm delighted and blessed to welcome one of the bravest and most insightful individuals that I know, woman of valor, my hero, Ruth Wisse. Ruth, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks. But I have to begin by saying that if anything gives me faith in America, it is you.
Oh, well, thanks.
So,
maybe we could just end on that. And then
why not?
Thank you. It's very kind of you to say. So I think what we'll do today, if it's okay, is to conduct this conversation a little bit differently than I usually do. Instead of just raising a series of issues that we could discuss, I'd like to examine those issues, the issues I mentioned in my introduction, through the prism of your own life as you articulated it and described it in a wonderful series of essays that you composed for Mosaic magazine as a memoir, which, please God, we published this year in book form. And to use the remarkable story that is your life thus far to talk about the subjects that we address in Faith in America, because it's both an extraordinary Jewish story and in its own way also an extraordinary American story. Now, of course, it's not only America here. The skeleton in your closet is that you're Canadian as well.
Absolutely.
As we say in Yiddish, "Als be'einem is nishta b'keinem." It's the Yiddish version of "nobody's perfect," but we won't hold that against you.
Thank you.
And actually, the Canadian chapter in your life is also, I think, extremely interesting, and there's much to learn from that as well. So, if that's okay, that's how we'll conduct our conversation.
Okay with me.
Wonderful. So, you tell your readers in your first essay that about your birth. You write that it is in the 1936 City Register of Chernowitz, then in Romania, presently Ukraine, that lists Ruth, female of the Mosaic faith, born on May 13th to Leib Raskis is the best,
yes.
Raskis, engineer, and Masha Welser is the Velcher, housewife, residing at 43 Yarnock Street. Now, it's safe to say that if your family had stayed at 43 Yarnock Street, you would not be sitting here with me today.
Absolutely right.
Family made its way when you were a small girl to Canada. There you grew up. So I want to cite just a your description of Pesach Seder, Passover Seder at home after the Holocaust, at home in Montreal. You write, "The wages of freedom is gratitude. At the Seder we thank, praise, laud, glorify, exalt, honor, bless, extol, and adore Him who brought us forth from slavery to freedom, from sorrow to joy." You write, "Mother lit memorial candles more often than Sabbath candles. But on this festival of spring we felt obliged to celebrate also on behalf of the dead. To the miracle of Passover, I added the miracle that in the midst of war our parents chose to observe the festival fully. With their broken hearts, I don't know how they did it." It's a very beautiful passage. So the wages of freedom is gratitude. What does it mean to you, I think we'll start with that, to be part of the She'eris HaPleita, of a remnant, to be a remnant, and how has that formed your life as a Jew and as a human being?
Well, I think by putting it in that language, you're kind of elevating it, perhaps rightly, but that's not how one feels one's life. One feels it as just a very natural process. But you do touch on something that has begun to mean more and more to me as life goes on. You know, we all have to be grateful to our parents for having had us.
Right.
And I am that, of course. But I have to be grateful to my parents twice over, because exactly as you say, they not only gave me life, but they saved my life. And that they did that is quite unusual. My father was, you know, as I described, he was he had a very unusual life. He was just a penniless engineer one day, and the next day he was building the first rubber factory in northern Romania. He was 30 years old. They were very young. But he foresaw that the Soviets would cross into Romania, and so he engineered our escape, as it were. And we left our home in June of 1940, and we set sail from Lisbon on Rosh Hashanah of 1940, and then came to Canada. Now, that he was able to do this is quite amazing, so that is unusual. And then, relating to other things, my mother did something very strange as well. When we got to Montreal, the family, my father's brothers who had come before him, had all settled in the, shall we say, the most well-to-do section of the city. Why not? If they could, sure. That was. And it was also very convenient for them in their travel to work. But my mother, after 1 year, picked us up and moved us to the other side of the mountain. Montreal is called Montreal because it's around a mountain. So they lived in Westmount, and she moved us to Outremont. And why did she do that? Because that's where all the Yiddish institutions and the Jewish institutions were. All the Jewish day schools were there. The Jewish Public Library was there. That's where she wanted to be. So I used to joke about it and say, you know, ours is the only family that's downwardly mobile, right? Deliberately.
Literally. Right?
Literally
yeah.
Downwardly mobile.
Yes.
However, it had nothing to do with wanting to be among the poor.
Right.
She always wanted us to live as well as we could, but she wanted us to be in a Jewish environment, in her idea of a Jewish environment. So think of how much I owe her. You know, my profession, as it happens, is drawn entirely from what my mother wrought. You know, she moved us there. So that, I think, is part of the gratitude. Just to get to the point of what you were asking, we did not grow up in a religious household. Right. As I described, my parents were deeply, deeply Jewish, and they had both been raised in traditional homes. But they had left traditional homes, and for various reasons, they had made their own way through the 1920s. It's not fair to use the word secular. You know, what Vilna, where they grew up, where they were, you can't say it was a secular Jewish
So your
environment.
parents are originally from Lithuania?
My parents are from Lithuania, yes.
So
thank
we're
you.
fellow Litvaks.
Oh, well,
I
of
knew
course.
there was a reason I liked you.
Well, why else would we be friends and sitting here together?
Yes.
We have to explain that, by the way.
So it's funny you ask it, because I was once teaching this is directly on your field, I was once teaching a class in Ramaz in high school 20 years ago, and we were reading Yitzchak Leibush Peretz's, the Yiddish writer's, famous story about the Litvak, Oib Nicht Hecher,
right.
if not higher, about a Litvak who shadows a Hasidic Rebbe. And my students asked me, what's a Litvak? And I told them that it's a Yiddish word for somebody who's really, really smart.
Oh.
It's for a Lithuanian Jew. But it really means, I think, very intellectually. It comes to mean.
Well, it means very intellectual, and
Yeah.
it also means have a skeptical,
Yes.
rational view of life.
I don't know if you watch Star Trek, but I said the word Litvak. We are the Vulcans of the Jewish
Okay,
world.
all right. Thank you for putting it in contemporary terms. But what they used to call it, actually, they used to call people from Lithuania, Litvaks, they used to call them Salem Kep. This you didn't know.
Oh.
Salem
means
is a cross.
Yes.
And they said that every Litvak actually already has, he's about to convert to Christianity. The conversion's already
Wow.
in. Oh, yeah.
I never heard that.
Yeah.
They didn't tell that in the Soloveichik family.
Oh, well, there you go.
So you're growing up, as you say, in not, secular is the wrong word, but not a rigorously observant home. Certainly.
Right. But then comes Pesach,
Then
as
comes
you say.
Pesach.
Then comes Pesach. And this was so amazing. For Pesach, my mother changed the dishes.
Right.
Now, we didn't have two sets of dishes, but she changed the dishes
Right.
on Pesach. And we observed Pesach so scrupulously that, as I say, never to this day would it occur to me to have any chametz for the 8 days of Pesach. It still seems like a desecration. So that was quite unusual, that people who did not take the rest of their Jewish observance as observance for the Pesach, and also I would say Yom Kippur, certainly. There were other times as well. But Passover more than anything. It's as if they said, this is where we must do this as it was done. And there my father took over, and he would read the Haggadah both nights in the Nusach, with the intonation of his father. And they recreated as much as it was possible whatever Seder they had been at, whatever Sidorim they had been at. And that is such a blessing.
Yeah.
That year after year, for those 2 days, everything was taken so seriously. And I think here's a key to something that I would emphasize. Whatever they did with not a shred of irony. I mean, it wasn't as if they would say, bless God, whoever that is, as I've heard other people do, or make sure that you understand that they're not being serious about their observance. No, it was fully
So it was
theirs.
faith, you think?
Totally faith.
Yeah.
And then you ask, what is this, selective faith? Well, when you grow up this way, you're less bothered by consistency than you are by authenticity.
Right.
And whatever they expressed faith in, they had faith in.
Right. So this is interesting. I mean, it's my cousin Dr. Chaim Soloveichik, in his essay "Rupture and Reconstruction," he makes the case that basically in today's modern world, post-war world, no matter how rigorously observant Jews are, they don't necessarily feel God as a personal presence in the same way. Whereas the Jews that he knew from the pre-war Europe who had made their way to America, they were much less rigorously observant at times. But when they made their faith manifest, he talks about in Eli and Yom Kippur, the concluding prayer, they cried because they did feel an actual personal God. Is that your experience with your parents? Or,
You know,
yeah.
the wonderful thing about it is is that nobody ever talked about God
Yeah.
in our house. And nobody ever talked about God in our school. And nobody ever talked about God in my life. You know, it
Right.
is
But
not
he's in
a
the Haggadah, right? God's in the
well,
Haggadah.
that's right. So he is in the Haggadah, very much present. And as a matter of fact, reading the Haggadah, of course, everybody said, why isn't Moses the
Right.
hero of the
Cut him
Haggadah?
out.
Why is it? But my father, for example, the way he interpreted God, you see, when it came to a passage, for example, like not through an angel and not
Yes.
through a messenger, but
Right.
God himself took
HaKadosh
him.
Baruch Hu b'chvodo
Kadosh
v'atzmo.
Baruch Hu v'kvodo b'atzmo. So when he came to that passage, what did he do? He stopped and he gave his own drasha on this. And he said, you see, when something is important, you don't delegate, you do it. So is this faith in God? Right. Well, yes, it's totally absorbing. It says if you are made in the image of God, it means that if this is what God does,
and he's
then
the one who knows that had he not acted, you would not be alive.
Exactly. So this, my father really drilled into us, that if there's anything important to be done, you must do it yourselves. And where do we learn that from? We learn it from the Ribbono Shel Olam. Right. So there is an intimacy there that is encouraged, but it's not talked about. And I think you're right. It's something that is ingrained or felt, but it is not theorized. And I have to confess to you that no one sounds as silly to me as an atheist. You know, I've heard these debates, for example, at Harvard, they would occasionally have these debates between an atheist. And you know, Steve Pinker is a wonderful guy, and he is really a very brilliant fellow. But to hear him talk about atheism, I mean, it just seems to me ridiculous. I don't know how else to put it. You know,
so I think
childish.
My friend Rabbi Sachs said about, blessed memory, said about, I think Richard Dawkins, he said that, and he's quoting an Oxford Don, he said, on the surface he's profound, but deep down he's superficial. I think,
Yes.
I think that's
well, that's very witty.
Yeah, I think that's the...
That's witty. Well,
so you mentioned your school. So you didn't have the standard American Jewish immigrant experience of going to public school. Montreal didn't have that sort of system. They actually had separate Jewish schools. You were not part of the Gentile mainstream. There was no mainstreaming medium in the same way. And reading that, I wondered, this is a strange thing to say in a series called Faith in America, but it seems to me in a certain sense you were better off. Maybe American immigrants in the United States would have been better off had they not been able. They saw it as a blessing. Maybe it wasn't, to go to public school, which was seen as the great instrument of the melting pot. You had a very different experience.
Yeah. Well, this is a difficult question. There's no perfection in the world. Right. You know, it's a trade-off. And we know how much America has given us by having public schools and having this idea that everyone who comes is on an equal footing and you try as hard as you can to put them on an equal footing. There is that. But my friend Ezra Mendelsohn of blessed memory, a wonderful historian, wrote a book on Jewish politics. And he writes there quite explicitly that from the point of view of the Jews, the best society to be in is a pluralistic one, where there are the kind of divisions that we enjoyed in Montreal, because Montreal was a divided city. There were the French and the English. And when we came, as you say, there was no public school system. There was a confessional school system. So once there were Protestant schools and Catholic schools,
there had to be Jewish schools.
Well, there didn't, because the law said, and this is so interesting, the law said that Jews, for the purposes of education, will be considered Protestant. And I thought that, you know, that's exactly what they said in America, but without saying it, right?
Exactly.
So, yes.
That's what we call saying the quiet part out loud.
Yes, right.
Yes.
So you see a lot of Jews in Montreal, even in the early days, sent their children to Protestant schools. Right. And then in high school, there were no Jewish schools when I started high school. There's only one, and it wasn't open to us. So you see, the Jewish educators, or the educated Jews who came to Montreal, and many of the parents, they said, but wait a minute, okay, we can't go to the Catholic schools, but we're not Protestant. So given that, that the fact is that it's almost as if the space was created for you.
Right.
The sociological space was created for you, and the educational space was created. So that's why
But it
Jewish
was government
schools,
funded, right?
No,
It was not government
not
funded.
at first,
Not
not
at
at all. No, the Jews built their own day schools.
Their own day schools.
And there was, as I've always tried to point out, just so that you know how rich, if you will, or how fragmented, if you want it the other way, Jewish life was. Jewish school choices when I started Jewish day school were the communist Jewish school, the socialist Jewish school. These are Jewish schools.
There's a separate communist Jewish school and socialist Jewish school.
No, wait a minute. I'm only beginning here. There was a separate communist school. There was a separate socialist school. There was a separate left-wing Zionist day school and a right-wing Zionist day school. Right. And then there was a Hebraic Zionist day school. And then the very right of what was then the very right, there was a Mizrahi school,
religious
which is
Zionist
religious
school.
Zionist.
Yeah.
So you see the spectrum of
and where did you go?
We were sent to the right-wing Labor Zionist school, which was the best of all because, why was it the best? Not like this, it was the best of all, but it was just...
They had the best football team.
No, it was the best because it was called the Jewish People's School.
I see.
And it was totally holistic. And none of the others was holistic to the same degree because we studied Yiddish and Hebrew, and nothing was outside of Judaism. I mean, we never learned what Judaism wasn't.
Right.
Everything
Classes
was
that were
included.
in Hebrew or
well, Chumash was taught in Hebrew, not very much. Our Hebrew was very weak.
Right.
But we were also taught French, by the way.
Right.
We were taught French and English, and many classes were in Yiddish. Some of the classes were in Yiddish because most of us were coming from Yiddish-speaking homes. Right. So they carried that on. So look at how fortunate one was.
Fascinating. So you went to then a non-Jewish high school then after that?
Yes, yes.
And from there to McGill?
That's right.
And you studied literature originally, was the plan? Okay.
Yeah.
Now in college, I mean, there's much to discuss there, but hard not to focus on it given recent passings and recent essays by you about it. You got to know Leonard Cohen,
yes.
later a very famous, I think we could say, songwriter. Yeah. What I find interesting about your writing about him, both before his death, some time ago, and after his death, is that today I think he's seen as first and foremost a Jewish songwriter, a Jewishly inspired songwriter.
Right.
But your critique of him, as somebody who knew him, is that you actually seem to think that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that's not actually the best way of characterizing his most famous works. I think in your memoir you describe them as pagan at times, rather than Jewish. Is that not right?
Well, no. I mean, his first book was called Let Us Compare Mythologies.
Right.
And, and what I wrote about it was what I felt about it, that on the one hand, I thought how wonderful, because obviously he's not following T.S. Eliot and saying we don't belong in this. He was saying let us compare mythologies. And Leonard, even then, I mean, he made it clear that he was a Jew, and by the way, his family, you see, is the very opposite of mine. Yes. He comes from, as you would say, if there was an aristocracy in Montreal, he is it. Right. His uncles were in the Shar Shemayim synagogue, which was in Westmount, which was the wealthiest synagogue in Canada by far. And so he was to the manor born. And part of my, it was kind of an inverse snobbery. When I was at college, any guy who belonged to a fraternity, I would not go out with, So he belonged to the Jewish fraternity. Well, the way I thought about fraternity boys, I thought, what kind of a guy would, would join a fraternity? So it was very different from the...
And he was then a poet, a singer, a writer?
Yes, so he was. So that's the point, that he also was already a poet. And that did impress me. And as I, I've often said that, I can... my fame will always be, insofar as my name exists. It exists as a kind of a footnote to Leonard. So it is really in the big world, not in our intimate world, but in the big world. But however, what was interesting was that even then, our common teacher understood that he was a great talent. And so when he set up the McGill Poetry Series, the first book in the McGill Poetry Series was supposed to be Leonard Cohen's book. Right. And I helped to put it out. And that's how I really got to know him and became friends with him.
And then when you, in commentary, I think, criticized the Jewishness of his work, or lack thereof, as it were, or the problematic aspects of it, you heard from him. He got mad.
Yeah. Well, that was a surprise. This was many years later, and our paths had diverged by then. And we were not in touch. We'd not been in touch for about a decade by then. And I wanted to write about my college experience. Right. And when I began writing about it, I didn't write with a plan. And what came out was my life without Leonard Cohen. And what emerged from that description was how we parted paths. How he went one way, and I became this, from his point of view, this more parochial choice.
What are those two paths? Because I think that brings us along your own memoir, really. So what are the paths that you describe?
Well, at the time, look, every time in the years immediately after college, when we would run into one another, as I described, every time I saw him, he had some new enthusiasm. And the one that threw me the most was he introduced me to the I Ching. You see what this is, the I Ching. It was this book, the I Ching, and you were supposed to read it, and then you had these coins, and you flipped them, and according to the coins and what was written,
nothing about this.
Well, and what was written in the I Ching, I said, you take this seriously? I mean, I couldn't believe it. And then Velikovsky, there was something else, and then he fell in love with, for a short period of time, he discovered Kabbalah, and he was then, and then he went, of course, and became a Buddhist, right? So he was on a quest. And I think that quest was always subordinated to what he needed for his poetry, for his writing. Right. He was deeply, deeply, what was enviable about him, I suppose, is that he knew what he was. And he knew that he was talented, and he knew that whatever it took, this was what he was going to cultivate and develop. And then, lo and behold, that was my big surprise. And I said it to him at the end in our final correspondence. I said, look, you are the great hero of the Jewish people. They see in you their songwriter. They see in you their voice.
But should they, do you think?
That's a hard question. Yeah. What touched me, though, when you alluded to it, what touched me is that when I wrote the memoir, you see how I published it in commentary. Would you believe me? It never occurred to me that he would read it. Right. Had I thought to myself that he is going to read this, I don't know if I could have written it, right, because I would never have wanted to.
And this was before everything was online, and it's a
exactly.
Google search away,
and I thought,
he's
not going to see commentary or whatever, at this point. So then he writes me this thing, and you know what he wrote me? He wrote me, I didn't see you entertaining the troops under Sharon.
This is the Yom Kippur War he went to?
Yes, in Israel. I read that, and I thought, oh my God, is that where I've touched him, where he felt the sore point? Yeah, he got the point of what I was writing, and he was saying to me, when it comes down to it, baby, I am the bigger Jew than you.
You'll still stand by Israel, in other words.
I'll stand by Israel, and I'll do that, and so forth.
Fascinating.
And isn't it interesting?
Yeah.
It is interesting. So I think that I was both right in my characterization of him, but
you touched something.
But I did touch something in him, and that something was there. Obviously, when one touches something, it's not that you put it there; it's that it's deeply. You found it there. You found it there, and obviously, this is something that became more and more important to him as time went on. He wanted to write things like based on Yom Kippur liturgy and so forth. He wanted to be recognized as a Jew.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So. Just as an aside, when you actually describe meeting your wonderful husband and getting married, I just thought it was the most Jewish thing ever that that when you finally met him, it turned out that there was a family feud between your two families.
Yes.
that the one family in which your family had been having a feud with was
uncanny.
That's almost like a Jewish joke.
Really.
But so undergrad, you get married, you go to do graduate work in Columbia. And you were there to study Yiddish, I think was your plan, with Uriel Weinreich.
Mm-hmm.
Your first year, you study with his father,
yes,
which is the great scholar of Yiddish and the author of the massive work on Yiddish, Max Weinreich.
Yes.
I just want to talk a little bit about this. I mean, I grew up with Yiddish. We're not going to. Our topic is not Yiddish in America. That's your
next series.
It's not the Cynthia Ozick story, Yiddish in America.
Right.
But I want to understand this a little bit. You grew up with Yiddish in your home as a sort of form of Jewish identity, even as your home, as you note, was not a rigorously observant home. Max Weinreich, I think his connection to Yiddish was, not primarily religious, but correct me if I'm wrong.
For sure.
But Weinreich's famous thesis about Yiddish, just to sort of draw it out for people who did not grow up, I think it's safe to say that 98% of the 95% probably of the people who watch this didn't grow up with Yiddish. Max Weinreich's famous thesis about Yiddish is that Yiddish reflects what he calls the derech hashas, which is, this is not my field, so correct me, but that the language itself reflects a life predicated, in all its idioms and metaphors, a life predicated on the nuances of Jewish and halachic observance.
Absolutely.
So even little metaphors, like if you wanted to say that something's very small, you would say, "Es is as a klein v, v'sein talamotar and a klein sideral," right? So what you're referencing there is that there's an insertion during the rainy season for the daily prayers. And so since it's an insertion, it will be smaller than the regular font. And you're saying it's as small as that font in a small prayer book whose font is small in general.
Absolutely.
Now, to even explain that is so complicated. And there's literally thousands of metaphors and idioms like that. So what does it mean for, whether you're to speak of your parents or in a very different context, someone like Max Weinreich, at that point, sometime after the whole world of Yiddish-speaking Jews was destroyed. What does it mean to use Yiddish? Weinreich says somewhere that Yiddish's approach to religion is different than the Enlightenment approach to religion, where there's a sphere for religion and then there's a secular sphere. Whereas Yiddish in its very language denies that, because everything is a reminder of the derech hashas, the Jewish way of life. So what does it mean to speak? What is Yiddish for an American Jewry that's no longer connected to the very way of life that gave Yiddish its unique character?
Well, I think that you have no idea how painful, I have no other word for it, this subject is. Fascinating, by the way, as many painful things are. Why? Because he was right, in a sense, profoundly right, that Yiddish, as it existed in Vilna, where my parents were, at the same time that Max Weinreich set up the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research there, Yiddish was the repository of Judaism.
Right.
So, of course, people who spoke Yiddish in that first generation, and by the way, these were people in their first generation, one generation removed from observance,
right,
to keep that in mind, right? So there was a whole youth culture that was, as you were, not observant anymore, but it was all speaking the language that had soaked up exactly what Max Weinreich describes. So it could exist for that first generation. Weinreich's terrifying mistake was that he thought that because Yiddish was the repository of Jewishness, it could therefore also be the transmissive aspect of Jewishness. In other words, if Yiddish was in fact the language of derech hashas and you continued to speak Yiddish, then wouldn't you be speaking the language of the absorbed Jewish tradition? The answer categorically is no. And it didn't exist for more than one generation. Because even in his time, you see, he built a wonderful youth movement in Vilna based on that. And within 10 years, it was destroyed. Do you know how it was destroyed? No. It was destroyed from within by the leftists, the young communists and the young socialists who said, wait a minute, this is not what we want. We want a social justice movement. We want a movement. And so they destroyed the organization because it was not radical enough. So for them, Yiddish was not the language of Derech HaShas. They wanted to conscript Yiddish as the language of socialism, the language of the proletariat, the language of the fighting masses, and so forth. And unfortunately, you see, what you have in the United States today is these two divergent paths. So you have those for whom Yiddish is just the language they speak because they want to stay separate from the rest of the world. And those who sort of are drawn to Yiddish, and it's not everybody at all. Many people are drawn to Yiddish just because of various other reasons. But a lot of what people associate Yiddish with is leftism. Yeah. They think that the two things go together, that it's the language of the poor.
A Judaism without sovereignty, without statehood. Is that what you mean?
Yes, in many cases. Yeah. And Judaism is the language of the disenfranchised. So if you feel disenfranchised because you feel marginal for any reason, you feel that's your language, the language of the disenfranchised.
So does that capture, could one say, that the very story of Yiddish in America, even if we say, or Max Weinreich's project, to some extent captures aspects of the tragic story in certain circles of Judaism in America? That, in other words, Judaism denuded of its thickness will be taken over by the social justice replacement of Judaism.
But the other
tikkun olamitude of
exactly what it is. It becomes the language of a kind of, and they invest in Yiddish then all kinds of other values that really don't come out of Judaism per se. Just one footnote to this about the painfulness of it. Max Weinreich had two sons. One of them was Uriel Weinreich, who was actually a great linguist and a great linguist of Yiddish, and the other son became a priest.
I didn't know
Gabriel,
that.
You didn't know that?
No.
Gabriel, a wonderful man. And he wrote Confessions of a Jewish Priest.
You knew him?
I never met him personally, but I read his book. And it
Where did he live? I've never heard of him.
Well, he lives in Michigan, I believe. And
is it a Catholic priest?
No, and I think an Episcopalian priest. And how he describes it, and this is what is so touching, he says, people ask me, why did you convert to Christianity? And he says, no, I didn't convert to Christianity, and it's perfectly true. He said, I just converted to religion.
Oh my goodness.
And he had married a woman who was devout. Right. She loved going to church. He started to go with her. He loved it. Right. He loved religion.
And this is the son of the greatest Yiddish scholar in America.
Yes, he loved faith. And by the way, he speaks a perfect Yiddish. And Yivo hosts him sometimes.
I have to tell you, Ruth, when we started the subject for faith in America, I didn't know that we would end up with the son of Max Weinreich as an Episcopal priest living in Michigan. That's unbelievable. So one more thing, so you finished your graduate work there, because I want to spend some time on. We have to get to Harvard, of course, but
you don't have to rush.
Well, there's a moment in your memoir where you say that once you got to Harvard, people ask you, "How do you like Harvard?" And you say, "No one ever asked me that about McGill."
That's right.
So we have to get to Harvard, of course. So you finish your graduate studies there, not yet doctorate. Doctorate will be at McGill again.
Right.
But you come to the head of the department, I suppose, or
no, head of graduate studies.
Head of graduate studies. And you say to this professor, the only person not named in the memoir, Professor N, and you tell him you want to write on what you've been studying, which is Yiddish literature. And he says, no. He says no. Which is, of course, preposterous given what you've been working on. And you later find out that this man, and you didn't know it at the time, you didn't even have, as we say, you didn't even have a havamina, you didn't even have
It didn't occur to me.
Could never have occurred to you that this man was Jewish. and was essentially, you say, a self-hating Jew.
No, I don't say that. I
no?
say he was a Jew-hating Jew, not self-hating.
Okay. I don't know if there are
Ex-Jew or something.
Is there a difference?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Meaning someone who a Jew-hating Jew is the phrase.
Well, I say I like to use the phrase a Jewish anti-Semite.
A Jewish anti-Semite.
But he's not, to say Jewish is not fair
Understood.
either. You
This
understand?
gives me the
let's not
perfect
get caught up.
opportunity
Right.
to bring the intellectual level down for a moment, which is what I do here in these conversations. One of my favorite lines from The Simpsons, which is where the Jewish entertainer Krusty the Clown discovers that he never had a bar mitzvah, and he says, "All this time I thought I was a self-hating Jew. Turns out I'm just an anti-Semite." so that touches on our difference here.
Perfect.
So, well, what is this? So, however we classify him, genus, whatever
Right.
genus, what does this tell you about the American Jewish story? I mean, because for me, most of what I do here in not most, but a lot of what I do here in Tikvah is talking about the fact that America welcomes the Jews not merely not only in the spirit of openness, though of course there was, but also in part because it was inspired by Hebraism and by Jewish ideas, and because of the philo-Semitism of some of its founders. So it seems to me that one of the great tragedies, at times, of certain segments of the American Jewish story is that it's precisely in this country that they chose that allowed them to be fully Jewish and American, that's precisely what they didn't want to be. I mean, is that fair? Is that...
Well, it's not the way I look at it, actually.
Please.
I see America very much as a country of faith, and I'm very grateful to you for this series and for all that you write about in that context. But what everybody responds to, I think, more primarily is that they see it as a land of freedom. And I appreciate that it gives Jews the freedom to stop being Jews. Now, you may think that this is perverse, but you have to understand where I come from. If you were born in East Central Europe in the 1930s, and you come to a country where you can stop being Jewish if you want to, and no one's going to bother you about it, well, then this is something to bless.
Right. Well, the way I would say it is, and maybe a different view, is that obviously I don't blame America for Jews stopping to be Jewish. But I still think that one can simultaneously, at least just speak for myself, be grateful for the freedom that America gives everyone.
Right.
And yet still see it as tragic.
Of course.
That many Jews took the gift that America... America is not merely, as I see it, offering Jews the opportunity to be free the way post-emancipation France offered Jews the ability to be free. It did give them that choice, but it also gave them the opportunity to make Jewishness a part of their public identity.
Absolutely.
And to me, speaking as a Jew, not as an American.
I agree.
Well, perhaps as an American, just in light of what America...
Okay, what you feel America to be.
How I feel America was inspired. Right. That you can have, that instead certain people would end up not merely assimilating, though, also, but even somebody that it would help, that the freedom would be utilized to become someone like the Professor N that you're describing. That to me is very sad.
Well, the hatred part of it, or the refusal, that part of it is very sad, and that's just a reflection of a person's, right.
But he's not the single one that captures a certain segment of Jewish history.
He's not, but we have to allow for the in-between. So I would agree with you, and it does have to do with one's image of America, and not just of the Jews. Look, I think, to me, Jewish civilization is the most remarkable thing that I know. In human experience. The more I know of it from the inside, I just can't get over it. What a remarkable civilization Jews have created and sustained over millennia. To let it go is to me like, giving up the greatest treasure with which you've been entrusted. How could you possibly do such a thing? So yes, the fact that America allows for it. Not only that, my image of America, I think we agree on this, is strengthened by the fact that it would have a strong Jewish element within it, a continuing Jewish element within it. And that's why non-Jews built the Bible Museum. They did it for us.
Yes.
Right?
It would have been nice if Jews wanted to build the Bible
wouldn't
Museum,
it have?
though.
Of course it would. It would have.
That would have been a nice, as a
Absolutely.
testament to what the Bible meant to the founding of America, that Jews
Absolutely.
decided to build a Bible museum in Washington, D.C. That would have been a nice thing to do.
Believe me, I agree. That would be a tangent to get on.
And if they decided to give a nice job speaking about the Bible to, say, I don't know, some American rabbi and make that an essential part of his portfolio, that would have also been very welcome.
Well, I'm sure that you can still swing, but no. But that. So I think that we agree that the pluribus
Yes.
has to be maintained within the oneness of America, and
Yes.
it certainly enriches America to know that this can be.
Yes.
So we do betray something of both Judaism and America when collectively we give up the perpetuation of Judaism at its height and even intensify it through learning and new developments and so forth. However, for the individual, I'm on record always when I say that I don't like reluctant Jews. Negative Jews are a crime, but reluctant Jews, God, if you're reluctant, get out. Get out. Goodbye and good luck.
What is a reluctant Jew, do you mean?
Well, a reluctant Jew is, I don't know, to get personal, the people who intermarry for the sake of intermarriage, that their the highest thing to which they aspire is that opportunity. The liberal next step to them is combining the Judaism with something which they consider to be other than it, outside of it. They just don't want to be particular in this way. And let's be frank. Now that Judaism is no longer popular in America the way that it was until the 1970s, and it once was very popular, today it's quite getting to be less popular. Right. So to be a member of a tribe which is under some pressure, both at home and certainly abroad, where a lot is demanded of you, where if you want to send your children to Jewish day schools, you have to have the money to do it, where you have to protect Israel in the world, etc., etc. You know, it's a challenge.
Yeah.
So if you don't want to meet that challenge, you just don't feel it's in you, you don't have the grit, you don't have the desire, you don't have... I like to travel light as a Jew. I mean, as a Jewish people. I don't want to carry the ballast. I don't want to carry the dead weight of people who just don't see the fun in it, don't see the life in it, don't see the vitality in it. They weigh me down, let alone the negative ones.
You want proud Jews.
I do.
Yes.
I want not proud, I want morally confident Jews.
Yes, that's what I mean.
Yes.
Yes. So this is the perfect segue to Harvard. So
right.
you describe in wonderful. So let's spend our last 10 minutes talking about that,
Okay.
if we can. You describe the wonderful endowment of a chair. You're coming to Harvard, not just taking this chair, but I think taking the leadership of the Center for Jewish Studies at Harvard. You talk about this beautiful kosher dinner attended by the president, which is Neil Rudenstein at the time.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But here's what you write. You write, the security of Jews, which I took and still take as the barometer of a morally and politically secure society, seemed assured meaning at that dinner. But then you add, yet the tremors of unease I sensed at our table were about to cause a tectonic shift. Maybe describe what you mean by that. What did you sense, and what was yet to come? This is what year are we in the
1993.
93. Okay.
Yeah.
So.
Right.
What followed? What changed in the 90s and in the decades that followed?
Well, what changed is I think the result of what one changed is what one now experiences. I think that the origins of this change, by the way, which should always be noted, and I don't think ever is is that the Arab war against the Jews started in 1945, even before the creation of the state, and that by the 1970s, the Arab war against the Jews, which had lost on the battlefield several times, had turned into a much more a war of ideas, that it was pushing through the United Nations, through the disastrous resolution that equated Zionism with racism, and that young people were being paid on the campuses to push this propaganda. And the people who were now teaching Middle East studies began to teach anti-Israel Middle East studies. And Edward Said was began to teach at Columbia. And to say that Orientalism was the kind of a new manifestation of imperialism, and that Israel and the Jews were the leaders of this imperialism and so forth. So this pressure began in the late 1970s. It may have begun earlier, but the pressure really began in the 1970s. By the 1990s, it was picking up because what was later called intersectionality is this whole movement of grievance and blame, of all the little groups of grievance and blame coalescing and going against the idea of American strength and American exceptionalism. And
that was already beginning then in the 90s.
It was already beginning. And of course, since Harvard is one of the avant-garde schools, as it were, it was already noticeable at Harvard in the 1990s, but it became increasingly so just at that point when I entered the university.
And why, if we are to understand their, I guess, theology is the only word for it to some extent, or their doctrines, why are Jews excluded from the grievance of intersection? Why don't we count? Why can't we have grievances in this from their perspective?
Well, first of all, for the most obvious reason is that we are not when I say that Jewish civilization is extraordinary, one of the ways in which it's extraordinary is it is a belief of self-accusation, self-accountability. It is the farthest thing from a people of grievance and blame. So Jews are never...
But isn't that remarkable that the Jewish people were able to avoid such a mentality, given all we've said about you, you certainly didn't grow up a privileged class, I think we can say.
Well,
right?
No, but culture is everything, you see. And that's one of the reasons that Jewish civilization is so important. And that was why, at that point, by the way, very much to your subject, you could see all over Harvard, it had stopped believing in itself as an American institution. It had stopped teaching the fundamentals of American civilization. It was not invested in the Federalist paper. It was not proud of Lincoln and Washington and what it had accomplished. And in fact, there was a war against the soldiering. The ROTC soldiering was driven off the campus as an idea and as a reality. So all of this was happening. And
would you tell a young modern Orthodox Jewish student whose aspiration is to go to Harvard today, what would you say to that person?
If you go as a gang and you stay as a unit, yeah, take advantage of the great teachers that you can find.
There are still great teachers to be found.
Well, in the sciences and yes, I mean, I'm sure that in the science, I didn't say that, in certain areas, economics, here and there, even in the social sciences and the humanities, you might find a course or two which might be recommended. I certainly don't want to be...
If you really wanted to study the Western canon or literature, is Harvard any more the place to go?
I don't think so, no. I'm afraid not. Because my idea of teaching, of course, they wouldn't think that I was a proper teacher of literature anymore. Because my idea of teaching literature is to teach a text as thoroughly as one can, one at a time, within its context, and fully try to get at what is the essence, if you will, of this particular work, to the extent that one can hold on to it.
And why is that bad
in all its because they begin at the other end. You first learn the theory, And then you see...
And the theory is what? Of oppression? Of what is the theory?
Yes, well, all kinds of things. Even the theories of literature you begin with. I mean, it gets to the point of, yes, the theory of oppression and how does this book show you oppression and so forth. But even the theory of literature itself, before you learn
the text, you need to have certain blinders on of how to approach the text.
Exactly. The approach comes first. And I think this is death to literature.
So where can one get an education today? Do you think?
Tikvah.
Tikvah, okay. Perfect. You could still have the Herzl Prize now.
Have to earn it.
Yeah, exactly. You got to sing for your statue of Herzl. Our subject is faith in America, but faith in America. I want to talk about, as we close, about faith in you and as an American Jew, but drawing on something you wrote about in your memoir, Experiencing Israel. Most of your memoir, I think it's safe to say, is not about faith per se. Obviously it comes up constantly, but this is not meant to be it's not being told that this is not C.S. Lewis is Surprised by Joy. This is not a journey toward a certain, but you have this incredible description of experiencing. You write about, if I could summarize briefly, you write about a ride that you once had from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, with the Yiddish writer Leib Brochman, and he explained that he never leaves Jerusalem for an evening ever since. He's a Holocaust survivor.
Yes.
And he says he is a jealous husband, and he meant his wife is Jerusalem. He had a wife.
He had a wife.
But he means his wife is Jerusalem. And he says, no matter how late, I make sure to return to her before dawn, which to me sounded like the sort of the story of Jewish history. I try not to return to her before dawn. I look at everything as what's useful for me for a sermon. So I say,
come on.
But here's what you wrote. You wrote, and I hope it's okay if I quote it,
Please,
but it's a published. You say,
I wrote it.
The cast
you can
of
quote
this
it.
chapter betrays how deficient I am in spirituality. In truth, after a brief bout of devotion in my early teens, I realized I had no talent for faith and felt very fortunate as a woman not to be called on to pray before the congregation. And then you say, instead, I'd involved myself in aspects of Jewish national life that did not require pretending to more than I could honestly feel. And then you add, yet, on one of our first Sabbaths in Jerusalem, I did suddenly know how desperately, during the many centuries, his people were in exile, his with a capital H. God had longed to return to his city. We had gone out for a walk, and at some point I experienced the Sabbath quiet from God's point of view, not my own. Since then, I have recovered the same impression on subsequent trips to Israel, not only as an idea, but only as an idea, not as a sensation. That certain knowledge came to me only the one time, which was shortly before I traveled with Rochman back to his beloved. So, our topic is faith. Happens to be that I have to speak at the Jewish Leadership Conference about the miracle of Jewish Jerusalem. So, this struck me perhaps because of that, but also because we're friends, and I've had the great blessing, and have the great blessing of knowing you. Is it okay to ask you to describe this sensation? What does it mean to suddenly see Jerusalem from God's point of view? What did you mean by that?
Well, it's the hardest thing, obviously, to describe. It's just that, what is the largest thing that one can imagine? The equivalent of eternity in space and time. And to see Jerusalem from that perspective. And I think that is how Jerusalem is. The city works its magic on many, many people who come there. There are things called the Jerusalem derangement syndrome, right? That people think that they are the Messiah or whatever. So I'm not unique in having an experience there that others don't. But when you think of the city and its experience and all the rest of it, and you think of it from God's perspective as you as you have learned God, as you know God. The only way in which you know him are through these texts and through these experiences of holidays and so forth. You know, it just seemed clear to me that it would have had to be. It would have had to be. We know that the Jews had to recover it. And you're right, my impulses as a person have always been to talk at it from the ground up, not from the top down. You know, I look at the politics and, you know, and look at the enemy first, even before you size yourself up, etc. But at that moment, and since then too, you know, it's very easy for me to sort of think of it that way, that God needs Jerusalem. It needs the Jews in Jerusalem. It needs the Jews to have done for Jerusalem what they have done. It is such a sacred trust.
Yeah, that's very beautifully said. And we'll have to end on that because you can't do better than that. Ruth, I want to thank you for an incredibly moving conversation.
Thank you
it's been
so
such
much.
a privilege.
Thank
you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.